Mark and Sarah found themselves seated on the porch of their cherished summer retreat, a place that had witnessed their countless vacations, celebrated triumphs, shared laughter, and weathered storms. This moment marked a quiet farewell, not just to the house, but to a significant chapter in their lives. The gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of the sea mingled with Sarah's delicate perfume, an aroma interwoven with Mark's most treasured memories. Yet, something felt different now. The air seemed denser, laden with unspoken words. Sarah absent-mindedly swirled her wine glass, lost in thought. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, but her mind wandered far beyond. The silence that enveloped them was no longer the comforting silence of their early marriage, it was a silence pregnant with unvoiced thoughts, with words lingering just beyond the threshold of speech. Mark, observant as ever, could sense it. "I need to tell you something," Sarah finally said, her voice barely rising above the soothing sound of the waves lapping the shore. Mark didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a deep breath and placed his glass on the table beside him. Sarah shifted her focus to him, her face bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, yet her eyes revealed a heavy burden. She hesitated. Mark could see the restlessness in her hands, the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted between him and the ground. He had known for a while, but Sarah had been unaware of his knowledge. Before she could speak, Mark offered a knowing smile. "I already know," he said simply. Sarah's breath hitched. She blinked, as if trying to decipher his words, searching for an alternate meaning. "What?" she asked, a mix of confusion and alarm coloring her voice. Mark's composure didn't falter, there was no surprise or anger, just an unshakable confidence that this conversation had been predestined. Sarah's heart began to race. What exactly did he know? How had he found out? Had someone else told him, or had he always been aware, waiting for this moment? Suddenly, the weight of the revelation felt overwhelming. The wine, the sunset, the summer house, all the elements that should have been nostalgic now felt oppressive. She realized there was no escape. Pale and tense, Sarah felt as though she was being edged toward an inevitable abyss. The once soothing waves now seemed distant, drowned out by the chaotic thoughts swirling in her mind. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow. She attempted to speak, but no words came. Mark watched her intently, without anger or bitterness. He seemed to be waiting, observing her reaction. The silence stretched interminably until Sarah finally summoned the courage to ask, "What do you mean by that?" Her voice was softer than she intended, and Mark noticed. He tilted his head slightly, scrutinizing her every expression, as if he already anticipated her next move. "You think I never knew?" he asked with a calm that cut through the tension. "You think I never noticed the looks, the awkward silences, the fleeting touches?" Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again, her body betraying her. She shifted uncomfortably, averting her gaze as she desperately sought an escape. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, not even convincing herself. Mark responded with a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head. He wasn't there to play games or prolong the conversation. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Sarah," he stated without breaking eye contact. "John." Hearing that name hit Sarah like a sudden blow to the stomach. Her body's involuntary reactions, a slight twitch, a slower blink, a sharp intake of breath, betrayed her before she could mask them. Mark needed nothing more to confirm that Sarah not only remembered but also harbored lingering guilt. She bowed her head, fingers tightly gripping the hem of her dress. Though the night was warm, a chill enveloped her entire being. "That was a long time ago," she murmured. "I know," Mark replied, his voice steady. "I knew back then." Sarah looked up, shock etched across her face. Her heart seemed to pause. If he had known, why had he stayed silent? How could he have shared his life with her, pretending nothing had happened? But the answer arrived before she could articulate the question. "I chose not to confront you," Mark continued, his voice calm yet piercing, "because I wanted to deal with it my way." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. His tone was neither angry nor resentful, it was something far more unsettling. It was the voice of a man who had meticulously crafted a response to his pain. Mark inhaled deeply, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "Do you know what I did, Sarah?" he asked. She remained silent, immobilized like prey with no escape. "I told Emily everything." Sarah's lips parted, but no words emerged. She blinked, trying to comprehend his words. "What?" she finally managed, breaking the tense silence. "I told her," Mark repeated, his gaze unyielding. "I told the wife of the man you were with." Shock surged through Sarah's veins. It felt as though her entire understanding of the affair, and Mark's response to it, was unraveling. "You told Emily," she stammered, disbelief saturating her voice. She had always assumed Mark either remained oblivious or had quietly chosen to move past it, motivated by love, pride, or the desire to maintain their marriage. But now, the puzzle pieces fit, the nights he seemed distant, the vacant stares, the subtle shifts in his behavior over the years. He hadn't forgiven her, he had simply charted a different course for dealing with his hurt. Then a terrifying thought struck her: if Mark had told Emily, what had happened afterward? A knot formed in Sarah's throat, a suffocating dread taking hold. She sensed there was more to this revelation. Mark wasn't one to act on impulse. If he had confided in Emily, he had a purpose, and Sarah feared discovering it. Her stomach roiled. Her eyes remained on Mark, but her mind spun with memories and questions. Her affair with John had been a mistake, a fleeting lapse she wished she could erase. She had believed it was buried in the past. But now, her world was crumbling in an unexpected way. Her breath quickened, and the porch that once felt like a haven now seemed perilous. Time seemed to crawl, each word from Mark hitting her like a deliberate strike. She wanted to respond, to find words that could alter the course of their conversation, but her voice failed her. "What happened next?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark exhaled softly, as if anticipating her reaction. He leaned back, draping his arms over the chair, and for the first time during their discussion, a faint, almost indifferent smile crossed his lips. "Do you really want to know?" Sarah didn't reply. Part of her wanted to shout yes, to demand an end to the suspense. But another part, driven by instinct, was preparing for the worst. Mark lifted his wine glass, swirling the contents with deliberate slowness, and then, without urgency, revealed, "Emily and I became lovers." That revelation cut through Sarah like a knife. Sarah's heart skipped a beat before racing uncontrollably. "What?" she gasped, her voice cracking under the weight of the revelation. She blinked repeatedly, struggling to absorb what she'd just heard. Her chest constricted painfully, leaving her breathless. Meanwhile, Mark remained composed, observing her reaction with a serene demeanor, as if merely recounting a fact. "You and John happened once, just once, and you regretted it," he continued. "But for me, Sarah, it wasn't about the number of times. Once or 100 times, it didn't matter. The moment you chose another man, something between us was irreparably broken." A flush of heat surged through her face, not from shame, but from sheer indignation. Mark's words weighed heavily on her, undeniable and inescapable. "You slept with Emily," she echoed, still grappling with the truth. "For how long?" A half-smile played on Mark's lips, as though he were about to complete a jigsaw puzzle. "Years," he replied. A chill swept over Sarah at the revelation. Years. It wasn't a fleeting error, not a lapse in judgment, but a prolonged affair hidden in plain sight. "You stayed with me all this time while being with another man's wife?" Her voice trembled. Mark took a deliberate sip of his wine before responding. "Just as you stayed with me after being with another woman's husband." Sarah sprang to her feet. The night breeze whipped her hair around her face, yet she felt nothing but the fury boiling within her. "You can't compare those things," she shouted, her chest aflame. "I made a mistake. I regretted it. It never happened again." Mark remained composed, though his eyes held an inscrutable quality. "To you, it was a mistake. To me, it was a turning point." His words sent a shiver down her spine, carrying an air of finality, as if her betrayal had not been met with another, but had instead reshaped his entire outlook on life, marriage, and love. A wave of nausea washed over her. Everything seemed distorted, as if the reality she had known had been abruptly pulled from beneath her. Then came the harshest realization: Mark had never forgiven her. He had never attempted to forget. He had never sought to rebuild their marriage. All he wanted was retribution, and he had achieved it. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. The night air now felt frigid against her skin, but it was nothing compared to the coldness spreading within her. Her eyes fixed on Mark, yet she no longer recognized him. This wasn't the husband she thought she knew, the man with whom she had shared a life. No, this person before her was someone entirely different, someone who had meticulously plotted his revenge over the years. Her chest heaved unevenly. Her entire body trembled, but not from the cold. "You spent years deceiving me," her voice quivered, barely above a whisper yet laden with disbelief. "You spent years sleeping with me, looking me in the eye, telling me you loved me, while being with her." Mark stood, unflinching, merely watching. His gaze wasn't cruel, nor did it reflect any remorse. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. Sarah blinked, stunned. Part of her wanted to believe he was lying, that he intended to inflict the same pain he had endured. But the calmness in his voice, the detachment in his delivery, conveyed the unvarnished truth. There was no embellishment, just the stark reality. "My God," Sarah murmured, pressing a hand to her forehead. She felt suffocated. Her mind raced through every moment with Mark since her affair. How often had he embraced her while involved with Emily? How many times had he professed love without sincerity? A wave of nausea overtook her, feeling betrayed in a way she never imagined possible. "I hate you." The words tumbled out before she could catch them. Mark laughed, but it was a hollow, emotionless sound. "I know," he replied simply. "You know what?" "I don't blame you," Mark said calmly. Sarah glared at him, struggling to comprehend how he could remain so detached, how he could utter those words without so much as a flinch. "You destroyed me, Mark." Her voice was steadier now, though still tinged with hurt. Mark tilted his head slightly, as if weighing her accusation. Then he replied slowly, "You destroyed me first." The gravity of his words pushed Sarah back a step. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words formed, because deep down she knew he was right. An oppressive silence settled between them, the kind that felt like it could swallow everything whole. The waves sounded distant, as if the world had faded away, leaving them suspended in that single moment. Mark finally rose from his chair, slipping his hands into his pockets. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze devoid of anger or satisfaction, perhaps just weary acceptance. "This marriage ended a long time ago, Sarah. One of us just had to admit it." His words were like a final verdict, an acknowledgement of something that had ceased to exist long ago. Tears burned Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. With her head held high, she took a deep breath and spoke with as much resolve as she could muster. "You're right." Mark's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise, but he remained silent. He nodded once and, without another word, turned and walked back inside. Sarah remained on the porch, alone, feeling the weight of her decision settle around her. For the first time, she recognized there was nothing left to salvage. She stared out at the dark horizon, the wind now howling through the trees and setting the curtains in motion by the open door. The scent of the ocean lingered, but it no longer evoked nostalgia. Instead, it carried an overwhelming emptiness. Her anger had dissipated, leaving behind a profound exhaustion, not just in her body, but in her spirit, worn from years of living a lie without even realizing it. She heard footsteps behind her but didn't turn. She knew it was Mark. He stopped, maintaining a respectful distance, yet his presence was palpable. "What are you going to do now?" he asked, breaking the silence. It took Sarah a moment to respond, not due to uncertainty, but because she wanted to choose her words with care. "I'm leaving." Mark didn't reply immediately. He simply stood there, absorbing her words. Perhaps some part of him had anticipated this. Perhaps it was even what he had wanted all along. "You're going back to the city?" he asked. I am, she replied, but not to be with you. Her words carried a sense of finality, sealing what had been left unresolved until now. Mark exhaled lightly, not with surprise or regret, just acceptance. I think that's the best choice, he finally said. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight in her chest. How many years wasted, how many missed opportunities to talk, to try to mend things, or to be honest with one another. But it was too late now. She turned to face him, noticing something in his eyes she hadn't before. Mark didn't look happy. He didn't appear triumphant. He looked hollow. What about you? She asked. He shrugged. I'll stay a few more days, then I'll go back home. Home. The word felt foreign, as if the house had never been a true home, merely a stage for a performance that had dragged on too long. She nodded, saying nothing more. Then, without hesitation, she went inside to gather her things. She moved through the quiet hallway, where remnants of a life once thought secure lingered. Now, they merely represented echoes of something that had never truly been. Returning to the living room, she found Mark still on the porch, lost in thought. He didn't acknowledge her footsteps or make any move to stop her. She passed by, absorbing every detail, the gentle breeze, the salty sea air, the rhythmic waves, the moonlight glinting on the porch's wooden planks. Pausing at the doorway, she said softly, "Goodbye, Mark." He remained silent for a moment, then finally, without turning, replied, "Goodbye, Sarah." She crossed the threshold without glancing back, the door closing with a soft thud. In that moment, she understood it was truly over, not merely the end of a marriage, but the collapse of what she had once believed was real.